Hello and welcome back to my 10 favorite people. Hope you're doing well. I'm incredibly excited for today's video because although there's still a lot of arguing over whether Bitcoin has already topped or if this cycle is just getting started, when you zoom out, it still looks like we are clearly on track to make new highs in Q1 of this year. So all we have to do is survive the volatility between now and then. If we take a look at price structure, Bitcoin is still trading nicely above our 100K range high, and we even had a wick into that region yesterday that really spooked a lot of investors and I'm sure caused some panic selling. We also still have MicroStrategy buying billions of dollars of Bitcoin at what seems like any price, which is great for price in the short term, even though I do think it will eventually cause issues in the long run. And they've just proposed a new 2.5 million share offering to fund even more Bitcoin purchases, so I don't expect the market to go down too aggressively when it knows that an aggressive buyer is going to be coming in the near future. We're also seeing more and more announcements of various US states moving forward with Bitcoin reserve legislation, like Arizona announcing that public funds and pensions will be able to allocate a small portion towards Bitcoin. The Senate just confirmed a pro-crypto US Treasury Secretary, which is completely different from what we had under the previous administration. The acting chair of the CFTC also announced a roundtable on crypto market structure. So this is clearly something that's at the forefront for this new administration. And I think this is quite good for this asset class and industry in both the short term and the long term. And finally, we do have a lot of rumors of various huge crypto IPOs happening this year of companies that didn't really feel comfortable IPOing under the previous regulatory framework. So there's a clear incentive right now to keep Bitcoin prices elevated by these major companies, by market makers, because you don't want this asset class to be plummeting when you're trying to launch your $100 billion IPO. And we can also remember that it was the Coinbase IPO in April of 2021 that ended up topping the market, but we saw a huge rally and a ton of mania and excitement going into that event. So if we're expecting those IPOs to happen once again this time around in maybe late Q1, early Q2 of 2025, perhaps we can see a lot of excitement and rallying into that event as well. And when you look at this weekly chart, I mean, this tiny wick here is what everybody was panicking and arguing about yesterday with Nvidia dropping aggressively and all of these new innovations and changes with AI, all of the executive orders and drama coming from Trump. But when you zoom out and look at this weekly chart and think about the long-term plan and the most likely scenarios, you can barely see all of that chop and volatility on this larger time frame. And this is exactly why I called yesterday's free weekly report ignoring the chop, because this is the time period when the most mistakes tend to be made. When price bounces, everybody gets excited and starts FOMOing into riskier positions. When we see a bit of a drop and some concerning media headlines, everybody starts panicking and wondering if they should sell before things get a lot worse. But 90+% of the time, all of that chop just ends up being noise, and we would have been better off just sitting on our hands and ignoring it. We're still seeing great inflows and demand for the Bitcoin spot ETFs, and some small profit taking along the way is quite normal. We've seen a very healthy sentiment reset on the fear and greed index, which has been chopping around between neutral and low greed over the past few weeks, which is exactly what you want to see for the market to cool off before its next major move higher. And for all of these reasons, my base case remains that the next move for Bitcoin is still slowly grinding higher. Is there always the possibility of a black swan or some macro headline that brings down risk assets? Of course, but the base case for me is still Bitcoin to grind higher over the next few weeks, and any pullbacks are just washouts and opportunities before the next move higher, in my opinion. And speaking of the possibility of a pullback, there are some good arguments for it. We have seen global liquidity in a downtrend over the past few months. And if we know that Bitcoin follows global liquidity with a roughly 2.5-month lag, we would expect Bitcoin to still chop around for a while as it prices in that previous global liquidity downtrend. But this isn't something that absolutely has to occur. For example, when global liquidity was trending down in early 2023, Bitcoin ignored it and was still rallying higher, especially once BlackRock filed for the spot Bitcoin ETF. That resulted in quite an aggressive rally for Bitcoin. We ended up selling off because the SEC went after Coinbase and Binance, and we were all concerned that that would continue and cause some downward pressure on the market. So global liquidity isn't this one variable we can use to have 100% accuracy for what Bitcoin's next move is, but it does seem to be the main driver over medium and long-term timeframes. But there can still be short-term deviations when there's black swan or white swan surprises that catch the market off guard, whether it's a good news or bad news. We also have historic inauguration seasonality pointing to some consolidation and chop as well, and this doesn't mean that the S&P 500 has to do this every single post-election year, but it just means that if we average the past roughly 100 years, you see quite a bit of chop and volatility going into the election because of all the uncertainty. Once you get that certainty with a winner, you see markets rally into the inauguration because of all of the promises being made and all of the excitement around the incoming administration. And then you see a sell the news event with some profit taking, some new uncertainty with how much of those promises are actually going to come to fruition. And then once all of that is digested, markets tend to rally higher. And Bitcoin and the S&P 500 have been following that seasonality pattern quite closely. Both of them were chopping going into the election. Once the election happened and we finally got some clarity, they rallied up aggressively. They've kind of been going sideways, and now that we've had the inauguration, we've been seeing quite a bit of chop, and I wouldn't be surprised if that continued a while longer. So could the S&P 500 drag Bitcoin lower and have us revisit this possible region? It definitely could. It's just not an outcome I'm expecting or would rely on. We do still have the open CME gap there. We have filled the last 8 CME gaps in a row, but we can wait for quite a while before that CME gap ends up being filled. It doesn't have to be filled before our next move higher, but it is still something I'm watching over the next few weeks. Now, the good news is that although global liquidity is telling us there can still be some chop over the next few weeks, we have seen it recover over the past 2 weeks or so. And as long as that continues, that makes me very optimistic as to what's to come over the next few months for Bitcoin and other risk assets. And the main driver of that will likely be the US dollar index. We've seen a nice sell-off over the past 2 weeks. It's now seeing a bounce. So ideally, we'd like to see it roll over and break back below this risk-off region. We don't want to see this be another higher low into new highs once again. And the main driver of that will be tomorrow's FOMC meeting. We went from having 1 rate cut priced in for 2025 to now having 2 rate cuts priced in. So it's not surprising that we've seen the dollar index go down as a result. But Powell's comments in tomorrow's FOMC meeting will have a huge impact on what the market starts pricing in going forward in terms of rate cut expectations. So we'll definitely pay attention to how these change after Powell speaks, and we'll continue to monitor labor market data and inflation data, because as of right now, those are the 2 main drivers of the Fed's monetary policy. As for my portfolio, no changes made this week. I went into more detail in yesterday's free weekly report, but essentially I have enough spot holdings where I'm happy to hold my existing positions in case the market continues to grind higher. But I have a big enough cash position so that if we were to see way more chop, or if we were to see that bigger pullback driven by macro or driven by the S&P 500, it wouldn't be that much of a concern to me because I've already taken plenty of small profits along the way. So we'll see what happens over the next few weeks. It's hard to believe, but Ethereum is still outperforming our S&P 500 benchmark by about 2x. And Solana and Bitcoin are outperforming our S&P 500 benchmark by almost 7x. So it has been an amazing past 365 days, and hopefully that continues. I have finally updated my is it a good time to buy Bitcoin chart, and of course this is my opinion. I know there's people out there that think Bitcoin trading above 10K is a scam and overvalued, and there's people that see Bitcoin trading under a million is very cheap and they're piling in all the money they have. But I believe this is a really nice middle ground and unbiased way to approach it. This looks at the 200-week moving average, which we know historically has been a great price floor for Bitcoin, and any buying opportunities below it tend to be amazing opportunities for the medium to long term. And then I have anything within 50% of that 200-week moving average laid out as cheap, anything within 100% to 50% as fair value. If Bitcoin is over 100% above its 200-week moving average, I consider that to be expensive, and I have been taking quite a few small profits here and there while we've been in this region. But if we were to get over 150% above our 200-week moving average, I would start taking some profits more aggressively, because it also aligns with where I expect Bitcoin to top for this cycle if we do see that Q1 top base case that I've laid out in this video. So we'll keep an eye on Bitcoin's extension from its 200-week. As for Solana, pretty ugly deviation above its 2021 all-time high and its November swing high that we saw in around mid-November. We really want to see that level reclaimed. I'm optimistic that Solana can still do quite well as long as Bitcoin doesn't absolutely fall over. There's a lot of evidence that a lot of new market participants are piling into this market, which should be good for Solana and other projects, especially because Trump launched his meme coin on Solana. We now have Google searches for the word crypto reaching a 3-year high and reaching the highest level we've seen since November 2021. And that date should be special to you because that's when we saw our cycle top in November 2021. So it's clear that we're approaching the end game now that we're surpassing our last Mania bubble phase, but we would expect this cycle to be a little bit larger than the last one now that we have spot ETFs, pro-crypto president, regulatory clarity. We would expect the 2025 Mania to be larger than the 2021 Mania, but now that we're seeing us surpass those numbers, it's clear that retail is piling into this market. We're also seeing that in new small Bitcoin wallets being created. So this is Bitcoin wallets holding at least $100. We have that nearing all-time highs as well, showing that a lot of retail participants are piling into this market and creating new wallets, which is also a good sign that Mania phase should be around the corner. Now, almost every video I get questions on when's alt season going to happen and are we going to have an alt season? And I'm sure there's going to be some projects that do well. I just don't really have a good way of picking them. But my main concern for this cycle is we might have too many coins. We know retail is coming into this market based on the new Bitcoin wallets being created and the boost in crypto Google searches, but we have so many projects and there's so many things fighting for attention, whether it's meme coin, AI projects, real world assets. So it's pretty hard to see a scenario where everything skyrockets together. I think unfortunately we're going to keep seeing what we've seen so far, where some projects do very well and other projects just continue to slowly bleed out, which is why even though they may not have as much upside as some of the other winners, I feel pretty safe holding the big three because they have the most usage, the most users, and are the most likely to survive deep corrections and bear markets. But speaking of alt season, we know the main driver of alt season historically has been a huge rally in Ethereum. It's what triggered it in 2017 and in 2021 for those of you that were around. And I'm still optimistic for Ethereum. I know sentiment is terrible. I keep getting roasted in the comments for saying anything positive about Ethereum, which is a great sign. And funny enough, I was one of those people in early 2021. I was pretty much a Bitcoin only and threw in the towel on Ethereum because it did absolutely nothing and it had no usage. But then DeFi summer happened and we saw NFTs go crazy. And all of a sudden, Ethereum put in a 50x from the bear market bottom to the eventual all-time high. Of course, Ethereum is not going to do anything that big once again, but I do think that sentiment is where it needs to be for Ethereum to start its next rally. Maybe we have one last washout and create this inverse head and shoulders pattern. Maybe that washout goes even deeper and retests the 200-week moving average, which has been support this entire cycle. But regardless, with all of the bullish regulatory backdrop, with staking coming for the ETFs, with better regulation for DeFi and stablecoins, I remain optimistic for Ethereum going forward. We're also entering really good seasonality for Ethereum. Historically, the next 2 months tend to be quite good. February and March tend to be when Ethereum puts in its largest moves. And because we're seeing this sentiment capitulation and price just grinding down, perhaps we could see that pattern once again as long as Bitcoin plays ball. And speaking of Bitcoin, still no concerns for me as long as we're closing above 100K. If we go below it and close below it on a weekly closing basis, we can reassess and see what's likely going to happen from there. But as of right now, I'm still optimistic that the future is bright and we still haven't put in the top for this cycle. As for traditional markets, the S&P 500 isn't really doing much. It's just kind of been chopping around. It sells off and everybody says, here comes the collapse and recession. And then it puts in a new high and says, look at how great Trump is for markets. Here comes deregulation. Here comes growth. And then it sells off once again and everybody starts panicking. So it's no surprise that with a choppy S&P 500, Bitcoin has been chopping around as well and almost moving perfectly in line with what the S&P 500 has been doing. But I'm optimistic they're both still going to perform great in the longer term. We still have huge deficits coming from the federal government, a trend that continues to worsen year after year, and we're going to have to resolve it eventually. We have been living in a multi-decade debt bubble. I don't know exactly how it gets resolved, but as of right now, what's more likely is for the trend to continue and worsen before it eventually resolves. So more national debt means more money supply, which means I remain bullish on risk assets like the S&P 500 and fixed supply risk assets like Bitcoin. But we'll see what happens. I don't see any warning signs when you zoom out and look at this weekly chart. I still think we're going higher until about late Q1, early Q2 of this year. Then the picture gets a little bit more foggy after that. But of course, we'll update our expectations and talk about the most likely scenarios as the cycle progresses and as we get more data. As always, let me know what you expect. Thank you so much for the support on the recent videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.